ready to start. It's been a very long and busy day with a lot of very interesting presentations across a very wide range of topics, but also very good discussions. I tried to go to as many sessions as possible, trying to beat the speed of light to go to different sessions, but I also heard from the chairs that we had in the sessions, but also in the presenters, the participants, that there were many fruitful, engaging conversations. So I think I'll tell you a few concluding remarks also at the end, but I think most people at least must have enjoyed this. We definitely have enjoyed the experience of listening to the very interesting papers and debates that followed. We're closing, as it happens in every PhD symposium, we're closing the proceedings of the symposium with the symposium public lecture. And this year, we're very privileged to have with us Professor Elias Dinas, who's going to talk to us about post-authoritarian norms and the ideological legacy of dictatorships. Elias Dinas holds the Swiss chair in Federalism, Democracy and International Governance, and he's also Director of Research at the Department of Political and Social Sciences at the European University Institute. He has a PhD in Political Science from the European University Institute, and he is very widely published. He's published in some very landmark, significant journals in his field, the American Political Science Review, the American Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Politics, and others. He is definitely one of the most recognizable political scientists in the broader sense, I would say, from Greece. He's also a compatriot, I think, from Thessaloniki.
Yes, indeed.
So even more special. He has written a lot on Greece, but I think the topic he will be presenting today speaks to the wider debates. A lot is happening recently. We thought that the rise of populism and the rise of authoritarian governments was a thing which was very, very much geographically located and historically geographically defined, but we see, in different forms, phenomenon of authoritarianism, of questioning democratic values, liberal order, and so forth. We see it coming from very many different places on the planet. So, of course, scholarship, as I mentioned also in the morning, is all about trying to understand the phenomena as well as providing, if you want, policy recommendations or public commentary. So it is very important that we have excellent scholars like Professor Elias Dinas to offer to us his insights, his research conclusions on this very important issue. So after the talk by Professor Dinas, we'll have the time to open up to the audience for questions and answers, for a discussion, for the Q&A, and then at the very end, we'll have a mini, not really ceremony, but a mini ceremony to close the event. So with these introductory remarks, Ilya, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vassili. I hope you can hear me. I will stand there so that I can also move the slides. It is actually a huge honor to be here, to be invited for this keynote, to be invited in this symposium. It is not my first symposium. I was actually participating in that symposium quite some years ago. I don't even want to name how many years ago, but on the opposite side, as being someone presenting in one of those panels when I was essentially about to start my PhD. So it's particularly nice and emotional moment for me. As Vassili said, this is not, unfortunately, a project that will touch upon Greece explicitly. You won't hear the word Greece very often throughout the presentation. For that reason, I do want to state from the beginning that there is a lot of implicit Greece going on in this project. This is, by the way, the title of the sort of the proposal that I had submitted for the ERC consolidator grant, which ended up being successful, and so I'm currently in my second year. So once one is into an ERC is almost as if one is into a PhD, which means you can hardly think about many other things than that. So this is why I'm presenting you some first results from this work. And as I said, this work has a lot of Greece without being about Greece. What do I mean by that? I mean something that I think unites us all. The whole idea behind the presentation today relates to understanding how we end up with a chant such as the one that some of you, maybe you are too young to know about it, others are not only know about it, but it's very hard to even forget about it, this chant about how people does not forget what it means to be right, which was originally a very important chant by the Socialist Party in Greece, used by its founder and leader, Andreas Papandreou, and currently also appearing even nowadays as something that has been seen in the streets of Athens, even this is 2024. The reason I'm saying this is because I have done work trying to see, in a way, both in early work in Greece and a bit later work in Greek journal, but also later on kind of more broadly onto the Greek case per se. And this is kind of a seed for the idea of how do we end up with such a sort of a chant, and what are the political implications of the underlying culture through which that is reflected through this particular chant. In order to motivate this further, because this is only, as I said, the seed, let me try to sort of navigate you into the sort of the question. So this is a map of Europe according to how left-wing or right-wing a given country on average is through surveys. And one even not very cursory look clearly allows someone to detect a pattern. Countries that used to be under communist rule seem to be more right-wing, whereas countries that used to have a regime that either identified and justified itself through anti-communism or was a fascist regime, in either case both related to the right, currently being slightly more to the left. Spain, Greece, Portugal, and so on. Now, this is probably well known for pundits and even people in general, citizens in general. It isn't so much a case of investigation in political science, precisely because in left we don't tend to think about left-right so much in contextual terms, but more individual terms. So to the extent that there has been any attempt to explain this cross-national variation, the standard idea has always been socialization. People simply didn't like those regimes, and so now they turn against them. Or a weaker version of this idea, which is the so-called thermostatic theory. Too much policy of one side drives people on the other side. Now, the problem with this explanation is that if it were correct, then we should see the older people by now, those that experience those regimes, to actually denote these patterns. Yet if we look closer into the same surveys, the same data, it is the younger that are clearly more right-wing in post-communist countries, and it is the young that are more left-wing in post-right-wing regimes, which is kind of brings the puzzle about what exactly is going on. And this is where exactly Postnom, which is the so-called, famous, you don't know how to call this, logo you need to have for every ERC project, from post-authoritarian norms. What do you see here? You see two statues. One is a statue of Franco in Spain. The other is a statue about heroes of the war in Bulgaria. This one is about to be demolished. This one is constantly painted according to American, typically oriented superhero cartoons. And the idea behind Postnom is precisely to look into the legacy of authoritarian regime, but not so much as a relic of the past, instead as a locus for political coordination today. And I will try to make this a bit more explicit in the following slides. Let me bring the argument to some extent in a nutshell. The departure point here is based on two premises. The first premise is that, similar to political parties, regimes as a whole can have an ideological inclination, as I alluded to before. Not all of them do so, but in the context of Latin America and Europe, and the context of the Cold War at least, we can think of regimes aligned to communism as left-wing, not only us, experts do, people do themselves, the leaders themselves do so, and on the other hand, regimes that either were based on their self-justification as a shield to communism or clear-cut fascist regimes as linked to the right. That's the first premise. Now, the second premise is that else equal, people would be okay providing a premium to regimes that give them more power, either by securing their rights or by allowing them to have more access into the decision making, or both. Which means that upon successful democratic transitions, we expect that else equal, the previous authoritarian regime will be not preferred to as a weak preference vis-à-vis the new regime. Taken together, these two premises, quite arbitrarily, one might say, I hope this will become more explicit later on, take us into the main general overarching expectation, which is that we will find a bias against the ideology of the previous dictator. What do I mean a bias against the ideology of the dictator? I mean some sort of ideological stigmatization. That is the idea that attachment or affinity to labels or other semantics that are related to the ideological side of the past regime will incur a cost in terms of social approval. Now, I want to try to make this argument a bit more explicit. So we are approaching a post-authoritarian transition, and it is important to have in mind that authoritarian regimes rarely fall because of popular turmoils or revolutions. And many authoritarian transitions do not lead to democracy. However, regime change, at least as a minimum, implies a change in the ruling elites, typically sometimes because of internal divisions. Now, what does that mean? The moment you start having an electoral competition getting increased, emerging, then this process generates incentives for elites of either side, both new elites and incumbents, to play with the rules of the new game. The rules of the new game implying essentially democratic norms. The key point here is that democratic credentials can be proxied at that moment via political ideology. If the opposite to communism is democracy, then I, as a new elite, can bring ideology into my discussion in order to stigmatize the past elites. And what is more, I know that the previous elites, the incumbents, cannot have any credible response to this. They cannot credibly claim themselves as anti-communist. Which means that then, essentially, you have a game whereby the new elites attack the old elites, while the old elites try to run from the past. Now, doing so might save them. It will not save, though, their ideas. So having no one to defend them, they are likely to be replaced by new ones which are more compatible with the new norms in place, which allows us to arrive to this expectation that affinity with the past will become increasingly incompatible with the current norms in place, generating what is known as authoritarian baggage. Now, from that idea, we will arrive into a set of implications about how the polity, both in terms of demand and in terms of supply, will look like. Essentially, everything I will be discussing from now on will be an application of this idea by some sort of asymmetry. Okay? In order to arrive there, I need to also explain one more thing. I need to answer the question, why would an anti-Franco bias result into an anti-right-wing bias? Or why do I expect an anti-communist bias to end up becoming an anti-left bias? For that, I do need some insights from behavioral economics. Work by Marenathan and others have shown that people do not think as Bayesian updaters. They do not take, let's say, very fine-grained points of data and gradually update the priors. They think in terms of coarse categories, and they classify stimuli under the same coarse classifications. Actually, we have information that this happens clearly in the case of party competition of politics, where the labels left and right have their own intrinsic value, and moving from one to another generates losses in utility that go beyond any loss in utility that you get from distancing yourself from the ideal point. In other words, there are some sort of well-observed, there is evidence, quite significant evidence for discontinuities generated through the political center as that divides the left from the right, which I think helps us understand why you can move from more specific to broader spillovers in terms of this stigmatization. Essentially, this implies a very simple pattern. Regimes that used to be associated with the left will have an anti-left bias, and regimes that were associated with the right will have an anti-right bias. Now, evidence for this, anecdotal, is already observed among elites. I only will bring two examples, which are quite telling because they are very recent, right? So when I was asked at the ERC, what is your most important fear, what is the typical question that they ask you in the interview, I told them, my fear is that I come to this very late. It's by now too late to see this. This is this basically 2 years ago, where before the election, essentially Sanchez says clearly that be careful, PP means Franco in government. PP means the Popular Party, which was the opposition party and still is. A similar situation in the mirror image comes from the outbidding, the ideological outbidding process that is taking place in Poland. Poland, a country in which up until 34 years ago there was no left in the parliament, where the two parties that were both part of the solidarity, one essentially the radical, or the more radical one, blames the other for being what they call comuna, making or essentially obliging the leader of the party when in government to generate some sort of clear declaration in order to prove himself that is not necessarily sort of an agent of Putin or any hidden or doesn't sort of hide pro-Russian feelings. There is more examples of this, of course, but this is just two of them. Now, this idea, as I said, will generate some implications about how both demand and supply will look. In terms of the demand side, we're expecting people to at least place themselves openly or discuss openly way more, to be more likely to do that if they are on the right side, let's say, ideologically of history. In other words, we will see a wedge distribution in terms of ideological placement. Preferences for parties will be affected in the same asymmetric way. The way I place political parties, if there is a stigmatized side, will also be affected by this process. In other words, if I don't like a party, I'm more likely to bring it more to the right. If I am in a post-right regime, and more to the left if I'm in a post-left regime. It's not only ideology per se that will be affected, but there will also be spillovers according to the issues that are correlated already with the ideology. So you can see, for example, cases such as in Spain is a very clear example, how being always the first country now against Israel, against the continuation of the invasion of Israel in Gaza, in favor of accepting immigrants and refugees in 2015, the country with the highest preference for distribution among the middle class, among those who are above the median income voter. You would also have political discussion being asymmetrical, comfortable or uncomfortable, according to whether you feel that you are discussing within a setup whereby your ideas are more accepted and more, more socially accepted, which in a limit can arrive up to the formation of echo chambers. On the supply side, which is what I will discuss more today, you are going to expect to have some sort of asymmetric fragmentation. In other words, there will be, if there is a penalty to be incurred on being on the side of the dictator, then you will see more parties on the opposite side. And those parties that are on the side of the dictator, they will try to conceal their ideology, either through semantics or even arrive to do so through their own policy stances, in a way that is more binding from policy and also more costly for them. Political rhetoric will also be affected, with those who, again, feel that history is on their favor be more likely to bring it more into the discussion, whereas the others trying to deviate from this and abstain from this, bringing issues that are orthogonal to history, such as managerial competence or other valence issues. Today, I'll give you one example of how this altogether makes kind of potentially some sense. So it generates a kind of a paradox. So what you see here is right-wing parties in post-right-wing regimes and established democracies. The countries, that is, where we do not think of them as being treated with any past regime in the remote past, let's say, whereas which could have any ideological sort of inclination. Say established democracies, okay? And so you see the right-wing parties. According to the manifestos, the right-wing parties of the right-wing regimes are more left-wing than the right-wing parties of established democracies. According to their electorate, they are, however, being perceived as more right-wing than the corresponding parties. And vice versa with left-wing parties. The left-wing parties of post-communist countries try in their manifestos to appear more right-wing than the left-wing parties of established democracies. Yet according to their electorates, if anything, they are more left-wing. So the more you try, the less it sticks, kind of. I'm not going to discuss that in general. I'm going to discuss a more specific implication, or two more specific implications, which is the asymmetric party system fragmentation and what then those parties who end up on the dictator side end up doing. So I will start with the first one, the asymmetric party system fragmentation. Okay? So again, the idea here is that if there is this stigma can be conceptualized as an additional cost for launching a party on the former dictator side. If that is the case, and if that additional cost actually makes the utility from creating this party dubious, then you expect two things to happen. Either the party won't happen at all, so you have attrition, or the party will happen, but I will blur its ideological profile. I will try to not blur where exactly I am ideologically. Now, if I do the former, it's very clear that we will have asymmetric party system fragmentation. If I do the latter, things become a bit more complicated, because in practice, empirically, we cannot, of course, distinguish between the two. We cannot observe the emerging parties. What we can do is try to find ways to measure the distribution of political parties in the system. But if the rebranding that is happening is very cheap talk, then we might be exaggerating how much rebranding is happening. In order to, there are different, think of this as different costs for different signals. More costly signals are also more credible ones. So you can either have cheap talk by political personnel about where the party stands, you can have other semantics being used, or you can have already in the manifesto itself an explicit attempt to appear as more right-wing if you don't want to appear left-wing, and vice versa. We are going to look at the latter. We are going to use here a difficult, or let's say, from a policy point of view, binding, relatively binding, versus more binding at least than many other available measures of parties' ideology, in order to make sure that we are not capitalizing on cheap talk types of rebranding. So what exactly are we going to do? The stylized expectation is precisely this. In a post-communist country, you expect to have less left-wing parties and more right-wing parties, and vice versa in a post-right-wing regimes. It's very simple. Now, how are we going to classify the countries? So this is essentially based on previous work. I'm not going to discuss very much decisions about this. Essentially, we have we can discuss, of course, in the Q&A now in the presentation. I mean, we have essentially three types of countries. We have former left-wing autocracies, not typically, post-communist countries, right-wing autocracies, the ones I described previously, and what we call established democracies. I will show them to you in a second in the map. And what we know already from existing literature is an established, accepted year of democratic transition, when essentially we start having competitive election. So green is established democracies, red is post-left-wing regime, blue is post-right-wing regime. And this is Europe, and this is Latin America. We always count the last authoritarian spell, not any authoritarian spell, not the longest or anything, the last one. Okay, so we have, we will take data from the manifesto project. We also replicate everything with experts, but Essentially, we have 67 countries. We have around 5,000 electoral programs, and in 849 elections between 1945 and 2022. We essentially have 1,373 parties, and these are parties with at least one seat in the parliament, according to the rules that the CMP uses for coding parties. 2 in Southern America, and in the early years of the 90s and early 2000s for the Central and Eastern European parties, when there were too many parties in a way. The important information that we take from the CMP is where the party lies ideologically. Again, we're going to use different measures, but the standard one that I'm going to use in the presentation now is the one that has been established by the people who have created this project. It's called the relay, right, left, and it goes from -100 to 100, from very left wing to very right wing. We will also use where the family in which, the party family in which the party is based, and its ideological average, let's say, as an alternative way of measuring ideology. A party is classified as left-wing if it has a negative score, and right-wing if it has a positive score. Again, we'll have many robustness checks to address for this distinction. This is a very...
Can I interrupt? Is the variable you're interested in the number of parties or the political?
The number of parties. The number of parties. The vote of parties is endogenous to preferences of the voters, right? So what we are interested in for now is simply get the fragmentation on the basis of expectations of the parties. We don't care about, because if you start weighting the number of parties by the voters, by the number of votes you get, then it can all be because of voters. This is about supplies. Essentially, the idea is, kind of knowing nothing else about the polity of interest. All you know is the color of the past regime. You make assumptions about the decision-making process of a political entrepreneur. Where does that take us to in terms of party system fragmentation? And so you see already somehow here, with the very raw data, the pattern, right? So this is the green is established democracies, and the red is post-communist regime, and you see that it starts tilting towards the right in terms of the left-right score. And the mirror image, even if a bit less clear, happens in post-right-wing regimes vis-a-vis the same established democracies. Now, yes, of course, Kevin.
So you're looking at the number of parties, not the percentage votes.
No.
These countries have very different electoral systems.
Mm-hmm. That's true, they do. And now, I don't know how much let's imagine proportionality, right? Like, let's imagine the district magnitude. I don't know whether and to what extent this correlates with the type of authoritarian regime, if any, you have. But as I'm trying to, because of the fact, like, an alternative way to think about this is, why would the electoral system apply on the one side of the ideological side, right? So if you think that the electoral system matters, it's something for the country as a whole, for the system as a whole. So you would expect less or more parties. Here, the question is more about whether you have more or less party on one side or the other.
No, I take that point, but what you have are countries which might skew the results. So Greece reinforced proportional representation up to 1974 was not friendly to small parties. The Spanish electoral system was. And this then impacts the results that you get.
Of course, but it doesn't impact the results that I get in terms of the treatment that is being assigned to it. In other words, it doesn't have, at least a priori, if there's nothing going on, it shouldn't have a differential effect for left wing versus right wing. If it helps, all I'm looking at is the percentage of left wing parties of the total parties. Okay, I'm not looking into, in the beginning at least, numbers, raw numbers. I'm looking only at the percentage of left among the total numbers, the total number of parties.
Wouldn't it sustain your...
Yes?
Wouldn't it sustain the argument better if you were looking at what voters are voting for? Because you're talking about a reaction against an authoritarian period. So then people vote one way or the other. The configuration of the number of parties seems to be somehow separate from the argument you want to make.
So, I see the point. So basically, I have done this, for example. Okay, I have done parts of this. This is demand. This is voters. I want to see now, I want to explain supply. I don't want to explain supply as resulting as a result of demand as well. I'm thinking, okay, given that, in a way, the idea is this stigmatization is perceived by both citizens and elites. It's a political characteristic. If so, it should affect entrepreneurs in a way before needing to see anything related to voters, right? If this thing exists and if this thing becomes, is sort of relevant for the polity in case. Hence, the idea of looking directly at demand and not allow, I will have actually robustness checks in which I will try to take into consideration to see how much my results change when you weight, for example, the parties according to the votes. It doesn't change much, but that's endogenous. Demand is endogenous, right? Like if I start getting demand into consideration, it's equivalent to post-treatment bias. It happens on top of the supply. What I want to see the supply itself. I don't care if, you know, I want to think of the entrepreneur and see whether this bias could affect how many parties we have, leaving aside for now whether we should think of this as, you know, the weighted average of demand. That's, you know, anyway, it's, you know, one has to take decisions eventually, I guess. So, just to show you exactly how we work on this. So we take the difference in the proportion of left parties. It's essentially the average error of left-wing parties minus the average in a given regime versus in a given election, the average share of left-wing parties in a democratic regime. And the same for the right-wing parties. So essentially, the difference in this difference is essentially the percentage of left-wing parties across former left-wing regimes in the election taking place in some year T or some number of years since transition. So let me show you some of the empirical findings. So this is the difference in the proportion of left-wing parties between, essentially, the blue line is always post-right-wing regimes and established democracies, and this is the difference between post-communist regimes and established democracies from year 0 of transition up to year 30 of transition. Okay, and so you see more left-wing parties vis-a-vis established democracies in post-right-wing regimes, and less left-wing parties vis-a-vis established democracies in post-communist countries. Now, there is a different way of thinking of this running variable. You can think of this either in terms of years since transition or in terms of actual years. You will lose something, you will gain something. Here, you control for the maturity of democracy, but you are kind of vulnerable to period effects. Here, you control for period effects, but you are flexible. You are vulnerable to how mature a given democratic regime is. Essentially, the results are pretty much similar in terms of the differences between the two. And we also have a more encompassing way of measuring this, which is kind of a resemblance of a quasi-staggered diff in diff, where for every treated country, we have a set of control countries centered according to the transition year in that treated country. And we allow time, we are modeling now time, we are not allowed the data to show us a trajectory over time. We model time in a flexible way by having up to a third polynomial. I'm going to show you directly the results because I don't think it's going to be very easy to explain through the whole equation right now. It will take time, but essentially the idea is very simple. This is model now, not raw data. It is the proportion of left-wing parties in post-right-wing regimes vis-a-vis established democracies, in post-communist countries vis-a-vis established democracies, with the first, second, or third polynomial, just for robustness. And this is year 0, as predicted through the model, the first year of transition. And we see that it is how many parties you will have, left-wing parties, the percentage of left-wing parties vis-a-vis established democracies, and you see the difference is negative for post-communist countries. It is positive for post-right-wing regimes. And why do you see all of this? Because in each case, we leave one country out. Leaving one country out doesn't change, doesn't really change anything here. So the results are not driven by single countries. Now, we have a series of robustness checks about whether we use different ways of measuring ideology, whether we have split geographically the sample, whether Austria and Germany and Italy, because they are more historical, let's say, post-authoritarian, right-wing authoritarian regimes, whether we use them as, we treat them as stable democracies. Results really don't say much, and we don't find any difference between post-Soviet versus non-post-Soviet left-wing regimes. We don't find any differences between countries who had what we call as homegrown communism versus countries that had imposed communism. It's not about Soviet versus not Soviet. It's not about homegrown versus not homegrown. The results are pretty much similar. Just to give you an example, I guess. I'd rather not give an example because it seems it doesn't work. But don't worry. I mean, you can take my word for it, and also I can send you the slides, the paper. More importantly, these are the same tests because we have two tests, right? You have the non-parametric analysis, and we have the staggered quasi-diff and diff. We have two sets of robustness for both of them. Now, importantly, there are some alternative explanations. Potentially, there is one also with respect to the electoral system, as Kevin said. But there is others that we at least thought about and we try to address. The first one, whether simply you have socioeconomic difference going on. Now, the problem with adding the economy after the regime changes, again, it's post-treatment. We do that. We do include GDP per capita and other variables, and we find very similar results. Importantly, this is kind of important. In the post-communist literature, by the way, I have to say, this project is a project that, for those who are familiar with bounds in statistics, is like Mansky. Like, you go as far as you can go, making minimal assumptions, knowing hardly anything. So here, we are coming into a literature that until now has looking into countries specifically or has looking into post-communist countries per se. We are trying to be broader and say, look, this is not only a single country, this is not only a single type of regime, is a broader dynamic. However, in this literature of post-communist countries, there was always this idea that essentially what matters is the coordination capabilities generated by successor parties. In other words, successor parties, it could be the case, have the resources and the knowledge, and essentially what they do is that they are better in coordination. Because they are better in coordination, essentially there will be less parties there. In other words, in a post-communist country, there are less left-wing parties, not because of the stigmatization of the left, but because the successor parties were better at coordinating the elites. So to address this is an important, I think, confounder, or the important alternative interpretation of the findings. What we did is we especially split the sample into cases that had successor parties that were successful or existed in the first place, and those that did not have successor parties, or the successor parties were not successful. If this is the underlying reason behind these results, these results should be only found when the successor party was actually existent and was relatively successful. Again, we don't find any difference in that respect. I can show you, hopefully. Let's see if this. For some reason it doesn't. In my laptop, everything did. But anyway. Now, is it because simply we're having voters' preferences that we are taking into that we are kind of not taking into consideration, and once we take into consideration, everything goes away? In other words, are they simply fulfilling a political demand? That, for me, is the concern. That's how I think of the voters. Is what I find precisely, responding to demand? And that's it. There's no stigma. So these are all true preferences. We don't find this to be the case. When we actually have the weighted parties and we add also the votes parties, we don't find any difference. And the last one is whether there are thermostatic dynamics. In other words, it could be that after so many years of a given rule, then you end up having a lost appetite for this type of ideology, so you go to the other one, what I alluded to in the beginning. Now, that could be, for our story to make sense, there needs to be something related to the authoritarian regime, to dictatorship. It cannot simply be policy. So what we tried to do was to find instances of continuous government of the same ideology. For example, in Greece right now, it would be from 2019 up until 2025, 8 years. So we try to have the number of uninterrupted ideological government in a given country should predict a backlash in terms of both voters and parties on the other side. And we don't find that in democracies, in established democracies. It's not about simply being long-term effects of having, let's say, a very, uninterrupted ideological government, even if that government in our case is not democratic. In other words, it's not simply thermostatic dynamics. Again, so we have some implications and some mechanisms. So first of all, there are some implications about the overall ideological leaning. In other words, if you think that the dependent variable here is a bit too nominal, we also saw that this ends up having an implication for the ideological distribution of the parliaments. The parliaments themselves, if you think of the real score, of the left-right score of the parliament, it does shift in the same way as the percentages of left-wing parties suggest. More right-wing in post-left-wing regimes and more left-wing in post-right-wing regimes. An implication is that there is a decline in ideological polarization. In other words, there is more clustering, precisely because part of the ideological space is sort of stigmatized. So in other words, part of the ideological space is less likely to be resided or to be densely populated, and as a result, you end up having lower range within which to differentiate yourself. And when we look at the absolute number of parties, we find that the results are not so much because of the increase in the number of parties on the opposite side. It is rather mainly because of the decline in supply of the dictator side parties. In other words, this difference happens not because there are so many more parties on the opposite side. Instead, it tends to happen mainly because of the fact that there are less parties in the stigmatized side. We didn't have strong expectations about either of the two mechanisms, but it seems that it's more because of, let's say, obfuscating than outbidding. Do I have 2 minutes? Or? Yes. 2 minutes, very quickly. We did something else. That's the last thing I will say, and then I'll stop. So this was party system fragmentation. And now we split the attention not from this to this. In other words, what happens with those who remain in the stigmatized side? What do they do? And because I only have 2 minutes, I will tell you the outline of the study. These are essentially the parties that find themselves in the ideological side of the dictator. We think that they should try to blur this somehow. In order to see if this is the case, we thought, how can a party do that? Well, a party can do that by either being less extreme, so social democrat versus communist, in its name. We use names. I can discuss in the Q&A why we think names is a fantastic semantic for this. It is associated very closely with the party. Parties are known by their names. On the other hand, it's very, by definition, by nature, very abstract. No one expects specific policy positions from a name, which allows room for semantics. So one way of doing this is by calling yourself social democrat instead of, let's say, communism. Another way is by using a completely orthogonal name with respect to ideology, a name that doesn't give you any inclination, peace or whatever, or something that is exactly leapfrogging, like Portugal, the standard example of Portugal, social democrats being the right-wing party of the country. What did we do? We ran a survey. I'll give you to the results directly. We ran a survey of, we took all these names, all these parties that we had in our data set. We translated all of them in English. And we ran a survey here in the UK. Again, you have to make choices. The reason we did the UK is because we needed one country to prevent variance in terms of the understanding of the language. We didn't want to have a country that is colored by a previous authoritarian regime. This is an established democracy. And we needed this country to have some broad understanding of left-right. Okay. So we took a survey in the UK, and the survey wasn't really a survey. It was a fake survey. It was practically fake. We asked people to guess the ideology of the party on the basis of the party's name. So we have the truth. We know where the party is according to its manifesto, And we have also what the coders think the party lies according to its name. What do we find? We find that if you are a dictator on the dictator side, like if you are a right-wing party, in a left-wing party, I'm sorry, in a post-left-wing regime, your name denotes way more right-wing than your reality. And if you are a left-wing party in a right-wing authoritarian regime, your name denotes more left-wing positions than your reality. In other words, we find that coders have more difficulty in predicting where the party really is on the basis of its name if the party is on the dictator side. A left wing in post-left-wing regimes and right-wing in post-right-wing regimes. Look at the difference in the slopes between established democracies and the dictator side parties in post-right-wing and post-left-wing dictatorships. This is reality and this is predictions of the coders. And of course, reality helps predict, but less so when it comes to countries that had a post-authoritarian regime. And this result is based on the fact that indeed the right-wing party in a post-right-wing regime will choose a name that else equal will signal less right-wing position than where it really is, and vice versa for post-communist countries. I don't think I have more time, but I'm happy to continue. Otherwise, I'll stop.
Another 4 minutes.
4 minutes, I do? Okay. What we don't know yet is whether this is, again, because of obfuscating or outbiting. We find more evidence for obfuscating. In other words, the results seem to come from the parties of the stigmatized side themselves, rather than, let's say, in Poland, parties trying to find names that are way more right-wing than they otherwise are. We don't find that. What we find is more, in Poland, the left-wing party is trying to appear more right-wing than it really is. And bear in mind that in this analysis, what we have here is the manifestos, where we saw already that there is some bias towards precisely following this stigmatization. In other words, our reality is already tilted towards the direction of the bias. Everything we get from the party is an additional, let's say, bias that comes from the semantic vis-a-vis, from a less vis-a-vis a more binding measure or proxy for the party's ideology. And then the very last thing, which is essentially the candidates themselves. We have interviews from the candidates of political parties across Europe. This is very much ongoing process. And we do find exactly the same for the candidates themselves. So the candidates, when they are asked to place themselves, the candidates of the left-wing parties try to be more right-wing when they are in a post-communist country, and more left-wing, those that are right-wing parties, in a post-right-wing regime. And they do so both for themselves and for their party. And even for the voters, although these results are different, they are less clear. And so the differences are that, which is kind of, I leave this as a question, while the perceived distance between the party and the voter is tiny, the discrepancies between the candidates and the voters are actually more noticeable. And we don't really know why this is the case. And with that, I'll thank you and I leave you. I'm sorry I spoke too fast and there was too much. Thank you.
Unmute my microphone, so I have. Thank you very much. This is very interesting. Please take a seat. Well, I'll open it up to questions, but as I say, while you collect your thoughts and you prepare your question, please indicate if you want to ask a question. But let me start with two comments, or things that I would like you to comment on, so not exactly questions. One is that there's surprisingly too much focus on the left-right dimension.
True.
And at least for the parts of the post-authoritarian world that I'm more familiar with, there's a lot of, I mean, definitely other dimensions. Nationalism is one, yeah? And then that would definitely affect both the, how much you can fragment a political spectrum, because if you make it multidimensional, you know, then there's 20 different types of nationalism, let alone of left-wing or right-wing ideology. So it allows for more fragmentation in places where, you know, the ethnic issue is not resolved. You can have the Albanian Communist Party versus the Serbian Communist Party in the same country, in a hypothetical example. So this is the one. And then the other one is this, you know, there's this debate of whether we have a crisis of democracy or a crisis of liberalism.
Right.
And you know, okay, assuming that left-right is all about, or you know, authoritarian, post-authoritarian is about democracy. This other dimension that also gets into the, it's not necessarily left-right, but it's kind of, you know, populist or whatever you want to, versus more liberal. It is perhaps, I mean, you know, we kind of seem to come to realize that this is a more important, you know, cleavage in society. You know, we don't necessarily disagree so much on redistribution policies or how much we spend on education, so the usual left-right, but we very much disagree on whether we should have gay marriages or whether migrants should be left in and things. And I wonder, yeah, I mean, you know, are these dimensions that you should be considering, and do they affect your results? Will they enrich your results? And so forth.
Do I respond or do I take?
While you respond, people will notify me that they want to ask questions. Okay.
Yes, great. Very quickly, I also want to hear the questions, so I will be very quick. Thank you very much, Vassilis. On the left-right dimension and the other dimensions. By the way, from the one of the implications was precisely the idea of how other dimensions, I call them issues, you can call them dimensions, I think better and more and broader, affect and can be, you know, can be dimensions where you will find something similar, and where will that, you know, as I said, I try to be as agnostic as I can. I don't want to bring any other, I don't want to use other degrees of freedom. The only thing I want to use is the call of the beliefs ideology. So my expectation would be, the higher the correlation between a given issue domain, a given dimension, and the left-right, the more you will find the same thing. If, however, there are orthogonalities between left-right and the given dimension, then there is no reason to expect any of this to spill over. For example, nationalism is one very clear case, but it is, and we have it actually, I had the proposal, but it is, you know, differentially with respect, like, essentially you think of this as nationalism being deprived of people, of citizens in post-communist countries, nationalism being the underlying ideological, if any, shield of authoritarian regimes and anti-communist regimes. Insofar as this holds, as a first stage, we should observe exactly the same type of things. In other words, being, you know, being Spaniards, Greeks, and others appearing as less nationalist, and else equal Poles and others appearing as more nationalist. Now, on the dimensions, you are totally right. Actually, because this CMP is an amalgamation of issues, and essentially people have split it into two dimensions. One, let's say, the more values-based, the second, we call it, and the one that is more on economics. And we do that. It was one of the things that we did in the paper. I didn't have the time to discuss. We do split at some point, and we do use these two sub-dimensions. And we do find, you are totally right, we do find that the one that is most sacrificed because of this stigmatization is the second dimension. It's not the first dimension. So when you think of left-wing parties, the proportion of left-wing parties, not according to the relay, but according to only the second dimension, there you have even stronger effects. Where you have less strong effects when you think on the former dimension. And then I have another thing to say about this, but it will take the whole, so I won't. If there is another prompt, I will.
There must be. Okay, there's a cluster of hands that I saw on that side. So can we start with the lady with the light blue jacket?
Hi, thank you.
I was almost a bit surprised.
Right, so thank you very much for your presentation. Really, really interesting. I have two questions. One is about time, and I really liked the fact that you actually address it. I wonder how you think about it. Do you think, because of course, essentially, the difference happens once we have transition, right? And usually most party systems actually form at that point, and there's not much change afterwards. there is path dependency afterwards. So is it the way you think about it, a question of the transition moment and how it happens, or is it something that keeps sort of lingering, as it were, from a norms point of view? Because one could think, okay, this is very plausible once the transition happens, then when democracy is the only game in town, no one talks about it. And then perhaps most recently, then actually maybe there are debates about democracy and so on, maybe it comes back, right? This kind of equation, oh, don't vote for Pepe because you're voting for Franco. I wondered whether we would read something like that 15 years ago, let's say. So is it kind of a bit of a curve in a way? And I have a second question about your third paper, I'm not sure now actually, but the one where you basically compare the two types of
the names with the manifesto.
With the benchmark, which is democracies, right? And I wonder how you actually think about the benchmark, because certainly from my work and from my readings, there is stigma against right-wing actors, even in democracies, especially the more kind of far-right, and usually they don't actually use the name that you would expect. Also, they have changed their names over time quite a lot. So I just wonder how you benchmark against that, because the benchmark is a bit of a moving benchmark.
Exactly.
You see what I mean? So,
Yeah.
Thank you.
We'll group questions. So Sophia's question was, I think, can we go?
No, it's great.
Can we go to the gentleman with the light grey jacket?
Hello. Quite stimulating. Really. So my question steps on Vassilis and Kevin's comment and your comment as well. So, and I'm trying to understand how a world that is rapidly changing fits your narrative and your methodology, right? So today, I woke up, I read the news, and there was this correspondence from Russia, BBC, Steven Ronsberg, saying about, using Putin is using now more Stalin statues, and there's a transition more to the USSR narrative that is, and this fits on the supply side, because you mentioned in Kevin's reply that it's more the supply side, it's not how voters perceive this. So Putin is trying to transition more to the USSR, Stalin's point of view, although he's a right-wing, and with your analysis, it fits nice, really nice, but now it seems to change kind of the narrative they have. And, this is from an authoritarian perspective, but if you move to established democracy, you have, for example, in Britain, Farage, that is BBC again reporting that he is closer to unions, so he's adopting labor narratives and policies. He's saying about scrapping the two-children cap, right? So these are all labor things that actually Farage is trying to implement. So he's becoming more left in terms of economic policies. And last week I was listening to Steve Bannon.
Turn it into a quick question.
Yeah, saying similar things, trying to push Trump more from a populist left, tax the rich, this kind of a narrative. So, there's this transition between how I define myself as a party and how it fits this, and how this evolved compared to the last 20 years. I would like your opinion on this.
Yes. Okay, great. Thank you very much for both. These are great questions, and especially the common one, which is to some extent also related to Vassilis' point, about the benchmark and the time. I split them into two. With respect to time, we wanted to be agnostic, so we didn't want to think of this as either, there is I don't have strong theory about what's going to happen over time. In other words, it could be that there is a smooth decline, which is kind of what we find, but it is what the data tells you. It's not what I had as necessarily a strong theory about, because it could be like that. We know social change is very abrupt. We know it could be cascade-like. We know from freezing hypotheses that actually, as you very nicely said, party systems are very sticky. In other words, you end up having what you have and that it remains as this. So there are different competing hypotheses there, which are all to me equally reasonable in terms of their theoretical underpinning. So that's why we try to be agnostic and let the data tell us what's going on in terms of time. Importantly, precisely because of the kind of the dynamics that you both allude to, for me it never made absolute sense to not use a benchmark. The benchmark is trying to capture exactly these global trends. In other words, if indeed it is the case that there is some underlying, let's say, bias against the right anywhere, that it would be captured, I would be capitalizing on that if I didn't have this as a benchmark. That benchmark is allowing me to clean it out. And it also, every time, now, of course, there are more smoother dynamics compared to the ones that we have available, but every time there is an election, a party is remeasured, right? So in a way, if now Farage becomes more left-wing in the one dimension, it will be hopefully picked up by the measure we are using by the time of the next election. So this is being picked up from the data. I don't want to explain all the variants. I don't want to explain what's going on in the party systems. I want to explain only whatever is being explained on the basis of this, and that's it. And on the, yes, I think I answered both, to be honest.
Yeah. Yes, okay, can we take another couple of questions? Then and then
we seem to be in a situation where tailoring is of essential importance. Thanks. At first, I thought, well, where's the surprise here? Regimes collapse,
Right.
and then parties emerge of an opposite character. What are we learning? And then I thought, in the context of some of the cases of Southern Europe in the 1970s, perhaps there's a question here in terms of what people think they're voting for. So with the Parti Popular in Spain and with New Democracies in Greece, did they think that Karamanlis and, was it Suarez, did they think that they were the best bulwark against the regime, against the anti-regime forces? In other words, I retain a pro-Franco stance, but this guy is going to be the best bulwark against the communists coming to power. And something similar in Greece. And you're clearly building an argument about reaction against. But if we look systemically, then there are also issues about how the democratic transition is managed. In both cases, there were restrictions. Karamanlis was heavily criticized for not firing people within the state system.
You didn't say that in the conference when we were in the... For good reasons.
You've given your answer, thank you. And in Spain, similarly, with the Parti Popular, as you say, they were castigated for being Francoist with a different image. So you're building an argument about reaction against. But then, if we're taking simply the number of parties as the key element, then what are we learning about the reaction against if we don't take account about the way the transition is managed? E.g., Karamanlis thinks that proportional representation in 1974 and afterwards would be a disaster because it would open up for the left more easily. In Spain, there are restrictions on the state appointments, etc. So there seems to be an issue, a wider issue, on your theme of a reaction against. So what we're learning is you're suggesting that in the transition, people want to react against the previous regime. But there are other elements in the system which seem to be far more nuanced in what you're suggesting. The other point in terms of time, of course, Sophia made it very well, but in terms of time, it takes some considerable period for opposite parties to come to power. PASOK 6-7 years after the regime. Similarly with PSOE in Spain.
True. One question, Kevin. Can we have another question?
Because I was wearing a blue shirt.
The woman with the black the color of
Well, thank you. More or less I have been covered, I think. So I just want to understand better. I think there have been significant reductions. I mean, the issue that Kevin mentioned before about the electorate and the outcomes and the voting in the electorate system, that I think can have major implications on the final outcome, because sometimes, you know, the amount of vote does not represent the actual elected party or something like that, you know, depends on the system. The other thing is basically, I'm not very clear. I mean, where does all the other arena go? Where's the Green Party?
Green Party, yes. That's what is the Green Party? That's really...
Or
Yeah,
you know, or
sure.
things that they don't go with
Sure.
this kind of manichaeistic model of left and right.
Yeah, yeah.
And the other one, so we see the development of where is the Labour Party? So, for instance, you know, the Labour Party has changed so many things, and many policies can go to right wing. But you know, so what is that? Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do I?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. I guess there is this recurrent thing about the electorate. Let me explain what I mean by this. Imagine that I did what you suggest. Like, I weighted the parties by the voters, by how many votes they get. And imagine that the formation, the logic of party formation is completely irrelevant with respect to what I say. If there is this stigmatization on the basis of the voters, I would find pretty much the same results, even if those results are driven completely by voters. In this project, in that part of the project, I didn't want to do that because I wanted to use the theory to explain the formation of parties without that being contaminated by what the taste of voters. In other words, I'm thinking an entrepreneur assumes, anticipates, understands, and does this. If I bring in the voter, then maybe the entrepreneur did none of this, but they are voted out because of voters. And so it's all about voters. I didn't want this to be about voters because I have done that. I want to do something which is now about the elites. On the point about the different reactions with respect to the transitions, you are totally right, Kevin. There is a very, again, I want you to be, this is kind of a proof of concept. In other words, one can bring into it a huge number of moderators in order to see heterogeneities of various types across countries. Countries of this, countries of that, poor, rich, when they had... I didn't want to do that because it's already big, and it's already big in terms of, as a paper, and it's already, you know, I want to establish the main idea, and then I can move to more nuances. That being said, one important moderator is the type in which the transition takes place. If the transition is bottom-up or if it is top-down. And you mentioned Spain and Greece. They are similar in some of the dynamics of the elites. However, you know, they differ to some extent how top-down they are. We both learned that they were both top-down in that conference, that they are clearly top-down also in Greece. It's all because of Karamanlis. So it is indeed the case that to some extent they are similar in this, but of course, you know, you have Portugal, you have other countries, and it differs. And I think that's important, but it is a next step, not the main right now. And in terms of a very interesting question, where are the green parties? You know, essentially, you know, the verdict goes to the evidence. If it didn't matter, if it may not matter anymore, that's why you start having new parties or you had new parties, or it may still matter, but other things also matter. In other words, the green parties come in, as for example, call them, these parties are like watermelon, they are green outside, red inside. These may have been changing, things are changing, you know, there are many things that are changing in the world. That's why I try to have benchmarks and to have also some, you know, different types of controls there. But of course, I'm not explaining everything. There are the other things and other motives that drive people to have parties and where to have them.
Okay, can we go, Will, at the top and start with the question at the very top, and then we'll come now.
No description of my shirt? Anyway, first of all, congratulations, Ilya. Congratulations, Ilya, on the project, and good luck with it. I want to go back to the question that Kevin made. I have a very stupid question. So in the ears of someone that is not a political scientist, it seems that what you are arguing is that ruptures in the democratic and constitutional life of a certain order long-lasting impact on the political, party, constitutional, and democratic afterlife. All right? At least that's what I got. I mean, is there anything in the literature that suggests otherwise? So how does your project kind of differentiate from what the literature has? That's the thing, right? That's what have happened.
Okay, and can we go to the gentleman with And second, I cannot.
So thank you very much. I think it's a great project and congratulations. I will keep on asking the non-political science questions. And I'm wondering about if you're taking into account the duration of the pre-transition regime. For example, in Spain lasted for decades, in Greece only for 7 years. Is that taken into account? I know that this question may sound too stupid.
No, it's a great question for me. Can I answer? No, you tell
one more from here. Will? Sorry.
Okay. Thank you very much. Acts of subjugation and atrocities are not only carried out by authoritarian regimes, no matter what geese they may well come under. So can you please explain when acts of that nature are carried out by elected so-called democratic governments? And I'll give you 3 quick examples. And in your presentation, you've showed that you've done a study of general elections since 1945. Now, the Labour Party, first time elected as a majority government, led by Clement Attlee, sent in the army in the summer of 1945, London dock workers working to rule and send the army to sort them out. And in the autumn, that same year, Liverpool dock workers, they send the army, and in no uncertain terms, had they not gone back to work, they would have been shot. One other example, 1970, Kent State University killing of students by the Ohio National Guard because they demonstrated against USA's incursion into Cambodia. And lastly, 1972, Conservative Party, Northern Ireland, Bloody Sunday killings. Thank you.
Yeah, very good one. I'll start with the last one. If I may. You are totally right. This is a matter of magnitude. It's a matter of degree. By no means did I intend to say that there is no state repression in a democracy. All I try to say is that relative to the authoritarian regime, on average, there is less. But I never meant to imply that there are not clear instances of state repression taking place, and sometimes severe, and oftentimes unjustified, within otherwise either nominally or truly democratic regimes and by democratically elected governments. And you give me also the opportunity to say something that by now has become, I guess, conventional wisdom, which is that we live in a very different world right now. What I am doing now, we could not, like a political science of 2070 won't be able to do what I'm trying to do now, precisely because the way in which we have democratic rupture is much more gradual, much less evident, it's much less based on abrupt changes in terms of the regime and coups. After 1990, the world and democracy has been changing in ways that are more smoother, less evident, and more in terms of gradual erosion. So you are totally right in both the point about democracies being also exercising arbitrarily force, and also in terms of whether this is to some extent, let's say, unique or not. Now, in terms of the two non-political scientists, you are the most difficult. It's always the case. You know, those who are outside the field are the most difficult to convince because they don't play the coordination game. They don't know. So the way I will answer is by saying there is a literature that has, field libraries about party system fragmentation that has never taken, not this consideration, has never taken the idea that, it could be that history matters, and it could be that the historical lens through which it matters are broader, and all we need to know is essentially not all we need to know, but at least we can learn by looking precisely into the color of the previous ideology. If this is self-evident, I don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it is not. I do think that if you think of this in terms of the specific, more parties on the one side, less parties on the other side, after you are being told, maybe you think, okay, then I could think of that on my own. But I try to see this as part of a more general idea, which allows me to explain bits and pieces about each given agent and, let's say, stage of the political process. And along the way, that gives you implications that sometimes are more surprising or more, let's say, interesting than others. So, on the point of Dimitri's point about the duration of democracy, The limit of the authoritarianism, you are very right. That is one of those moderators, right? I could say, okay, how much do the results differ according to the number of years in which you had the previous authoritarian rule? I haven't done that yet because it is one of those things that I have no expectations. I mean, I could generate some expectations, but I need. It doesn't seem to be so necessary. I would need to know, how much time is needed for given institutions or given tendencies, cultures to form, and all that implies some contextual knowledge that I'm not willing to embrace precisely because I want to keep this more generic in order to be able to explain less, but across a wider range. So yes, it could be a moderator. I haven't tried it yet, and thank you for the suggestion.
Okay, Elia, if you don't mind, we'll stop it here. Before I ask you to show your appreciation in the usual way, I have a number of things to say. Let's just say a concluding thought. We may agree or disagree on whether the duration of the dictatorship is an important variable to have in or anything of the other things that we discussed. But I think, like the educational part of the, your educational message before you leave us, for the presenters of the conference, we definitely, I would propose, we have to admire the depth of the work, the ambition of the work, the innovative elements of the work, but also more down to earth for, let's say, for current PhD students, the connection to the literature, things in the first slides were linked to literature, were justified. We take this year of the start of the restoration of democracy from that paper, and hopefully a credible one, not somebody my cousin wrote or something. And this kind of documentation engagement is the start from building upwards and onwards. So my 5 wise words before we close. We will have I'm going to say a few more things with thanks and a little ceremony because we also have an award that we want to hand out. Our very own Nikos Mouzelis Award for Best Paper in the PhD Symposium. But let's start by thanking Elias for his presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.